Hello and welcome. This is Kate Mackenzie, and welcome to my podcast. Today I am with the fabulous Andrew G. Marshall, writer of 20 books, Study with Relate, member of COSRT, and all round extraordinary relationship therapist with such a huge wisdom to share. He shares about his life, why he came to work with relationships and people as he does, but also how to look at affairs. What are the signs? What are the different kinds of affairs? And what are the stages of mending an affair? And is that possible? So I really hope that you enjoy this one. I really did. He's so great, and I'd love to interview him more. And in fact, he's motivated me to really start interviewing therapists more, which I haven't been doing. So thank you, Andrew. This was really, really wonderful. Welcome, Andrew. So lovely to be with you today. What a privilege. And today also, Andrew, I'm going to ask you various questions about you, your life, and your life's work. You've done so many books and so many podcasts and so many contributions to the field of relationships. I'd love to ask you about that. But to start with, because it seems so significant to me, if I could ask you about this, what brought you to the field of relationships? What was driving you?
I think there's a difference between what you consciously decide to do and what you unconsciously decide to do. So I think I'm going to answer the unconscious one, which is that relationships, which was that feelings were forbidden topics in my family. We didn't talk about feelings. In fact, if I'd put a gun to my parents' head, they would probably say that feelings make things worse, because if you're rational, you can sort all these things out, but those nasty feelings are going to get in the way. So the things that are forbidden, of course, are the things that always interest you the most. I was also not somebody that fitted in particularly well to my family. I just couldn't shut up about feelings. I was that terrible thing, a sensitive child. And my parents' number one complaint about me was that I was too sensitive. And so I think that when I actually came across the whole topic of relationships and people that actually specifically worked on relationships, that it was like a sort of light went on inside. And fortunately, I was astute enough to realize that there was a reason this light went off inside, and I should go further into that world.
And how was it when you were getting involved in relationships and bringing partners home? And I know, because you talked to me when you interviewed me about, your partner dying, which is so huge. But how was it when you brought partners in, connecting that with your parents, and how did they respond to you around your sexuality and your relationships? How did they?
Well, you've got to bear in mind that I'm now in my 60s. So when I was growing up in the 70s and starting to have relationships, we were in a world, I'm gay, but relationships, gay relationships, they were not on the telly. You wouldn't see them in the equivalent of EastEnders. EastEnders didn't exist even. I'm so old that I remember the world before EastEnders. So there was nothing gay on the television, and even characters like Mr. Humphreys in Are You Being Served would not be presented as gay. They'd be presented as effeminate, but that was different from being gay. And they were a source of amusement and fun. So, and I had girlfriends, and so I brought girlfriends home. But my parents were a little bit uncomfortable about them. It was sort of always a little bit sort of something to be teased about. So it was a way of distancing that. And then when I stopped bringing girlfriends home, because we never talked about relationships, they didn't ask, why are you not having relationships? So I sort of had to bring the topic up myself. So, which is sort of natural, but I think I came out for those days very late. I was something like 30 when I came out to my parents. And they just thought I was busy with work.
So how was it when you came out?
Well, it was a little bit of an anticlimax. My mother complained that I hadn't forewarned her so she could manage this piece of information with my father. And so the next day I asked her, how he had responded. And she said, oh, we didn't have time to talk. So I followed that up about 2 weeks later and asked, and they still hadn't had time to talk about it. So you have to realize this is a family that does not talk about feelings. What do? I spend my whole day talking to people about feelings, and in my spare time I do a podcast that has plenty of feelings in it. I wonder why that happened.
That makes so much sense. So did they ever get to talk about it and then talk with you?
Not really, no. That we're far too polite. They're far too polite to talk about those things. I mean, I have brought up this subject later, many years later, but these are all at my bidding, so to speak. So
Yeah. So that was tough. That was really tough, wasn't it? A very key part of you, your parents just didn't process with you, it wasn't allowed, or very politely not allowed, not included.
Well, in some ways it was terribly easy, because if nobody talks about anything beyond the garden and the price of Brussels sprouts, then everything is very peaceful, very easy. But it's also actually, you can hear the clock sometimes ticking in the hallway, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So in some ways it was really easy, but it was actually difficult to feel truly seen, I suppose.
Yes, met, understood, and connected with. So could you bring partners home?
I mean, over time, yes. I mean, it was my first partner. That it was a very silent first lunch, because although my parents could talk to anybody, my mother in particular could probably go into competition with you for ability to talk to people.
Thank you.
This was one person that she found very difficult to talk to. She said to my sister asked, what did they think of Tom? That was the name of my partner. And my mother's famous phrase was, we could find nothing wrong with him.
Oh, so to me it seems so painful to to have such nondescript, kind of non-meeting, non-connecting. Yeah.
Well, they were very good at practical things, that
Right.
if you wanted somebody to do a finger buffet for you for a meet for once was doing a play in central London, and I was inviting lots of people for a showcase, etc., etc. My mother volunteered to provide a buffet lunch, and so she would be the best person in the world if you wanted a buffet lunch delivered to central London for 50 people. Call my mother. So that they were fabulous people, but in certain categories. So effectively, I think that's one of the jobs of becoming an adult, is you accept your parents for what they can do, you mourn what they couldn't do, and you come to terms with that.
No, that makes so much sense. And I suppose, I kind of feel so much love as you're sharing that, so much love that your mother gave service, right? And she
Yes.
really did. I mean, buffet for 50 is proper deep end service, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you were an actor, you were a performer?
No, I was a writer. So I wrote the play, and then we had a group where we put it on as a showcase to try and get other people involved and interested in it.
What was the play about?
Um, feelings, of course.
Yes, yeah. No,
and
yeah.
that was the wonderful thing about actually writing plays, because that at that moment, it's perfectly acceptable to put out all these emotions without actually being criticized for them. And other people, like actors, could step out onto the stage and do these things, and you'd be able to say, no, nothing to do with me.
Yes, it is. It's something incredibly magical about theatre. I worked at the National Theatre for a while, and people were reverential. They were reverential. They came into the National Theatre. They were literally, you work for the National Theatre, and I could see it was a church for the for the secular folk. It was a church, the theatre, and they had that experience exactly like you're saying, of being touched and moved and held to account even, or to understand different people's experiences. Yeah.
I mean, I did it as part of recovery, because when my partner died, I was in a dark place, and I found therapy didn't help me, which was rather distressing after you'd spent many years thinking that therapy was the answer to everything. But what did work for me was going to the theatre, because what happens in the theatre in the dark is it's about people changing. They start in one place at the beginning of the play and they finish somewhere else at the end of the play. It might be a worse place or it might be a better place, but there was change on the stage. And so going to the theatre and actually experiencing secondhand change really actually sort of began to unblock something in me. And I thought, well, if it's really healing to go to the theatre, what would it be like to write for the theatre? So I did a sort of like a long weekend writing course. And at the very end, we had to write a 10-15 minute scene, and a couple of actors came in and performed these things. And I spent the whole time writing about death, because that was what was happening in my life. And it was just the most wonderful healing progress to do that. So that's how I became a writer.
It makes so much sense, because if you think of traditional societies, the shaman would have been the storyteller with makeup and acting things out, and would have evoked feelings. Same with music and opera. But also, I found out something very interesting, which was there's these organizations who they tried, for example, to change certain things like gun crime in Rio, or female genital mutilation in parts of Africa. They tried to give leaflets and lectures, and they found, and also some changes in Egypt as well, similar organizations, they found that they were falling flat on their face until, and for some parts of Africa, they had no television sets, they had radios. They made soap operas. And in the soap opera, people expressed feelings, and people could identify with the feelings. And they found quite a certain percentage of shifts in culture when people could hear, oh, she felt that about her husband not allowing her to work, or she had to work only in certain ways, or the child felt that about genital mutilation, for example, or the guy who was commanding people to do that, he felt that inside. And they found that soap opera, just a minimal, simple little thing, people could get inside characters, which was completely different than explaining. That didn't work for people. And I think it speaks to a much deeper place, isn't it? Metaphor, story, emotions, that you have to get to in a different way when you tell it in a play or in a story. Yeah.
And actually, in my therapy, I sometimes use myths. So I will get a classic story, and we will deconstruct it, and we'll actually see what the feelings people have when they hear a little bit of a story, what actually speaks to them. And that is a way of going actually deeper into the sort of archetypal stories.
What kind of story might you engage with?
The classic one I use a lot is Iron John, which is a story for men, but I I've also used a lot of myths about being a mother as well. If you've listened to my podcast, um, Lisa Marciano, who's a Jungian therapist, she's written a very good book which looks at all the different aspects of motherhood and all the bits of motherhood that we find difficult to own and deal with. And she illustrates these with myths and stories. And I sometimes use those with my female clients as well.
And I noticed, Andrew, you've done so many books for heterosexual couples or for women. It seems like, you have an ability to speak to all, so many people who are not you, as a gay man, and I'm just, that's curious and interesting to me as well. So,
well, it's one of that's why do we this is a great question. Why does our culture throw up over and over again in every combination? Why does it throw up men that love men and women that love women? And I don't think it's any accident. We have a particular task, and one of the tasks we have is bridging the differences between men and women. So a man feels understood because there's another man in the room, and a woman feels understood because this is a man that's not actually following exactly the stereotypes of what it is to be a man. So they'll talk about their feelings and emotions, and they'll bring them forward. So it's almost like being a bridge between two different kinds of species.
it makes so much sense because I interviewed Peter York, and he said that he wrote lots of sociological books looking at different people,
Sloane Ranger, isn't his
Sloane Ranger, dictators' rooms, for example, and what it said about the dictators or advertising in the 80s or the Conservative Party. But people have assumed that he's a Sloane or conservative or certain things, which he's not. He said, no, I'm an outsider, and actually it's only an outsider that can then look and see the frameworks. And that's really speaks to what you're saying, that you could be that person to help navigate different structures, because you can see it. You can see it from different places.
Well, yeah. I can stand in both worlds.
Yes. Yeah. Makes sense, doesn't it? And what about, did you write books also about being gay and coming out or anything like that?
I did write a book on gay relationships.
Yeah. And did you find that did that go, was that successful as well, or was it different? Or
well, that it's being in a bit of a ghetto, that there was that I suppose I wrote for heterosexual people because the people who commission articles often they don't actually think they've got any gay readers. They imagine that everybody is in a nuclear family that's reading their stuff. And when you're working with heterosexual couples, that's what you've got for your case histories. So some of my books do have some gay people in it, but I write about my clients, and most of my clients are heterosexual. Although, having come to Berlin, I have a very different clientele that I had in London.
So does that change the writing?
Well, I think my writing's changed because I'm also older. So I'm interested in different things now. I'm interested in, this is the reason I have my podcast, because I'm interested in the intersection between psychological and spiritual material, because I think you need to look at the spiritual material when you get past a certain age, because the world is no longer infinite. When you're 20 or even when you're 40, it feels possible that you're going to live forever. But when you're 60 something, then that's, you have to start thinking about those big questions, about those infinite questions. And the answers to that are not just in the psychological sphere, you have to look at things like soul and spiritual matters. So that's what I'm interested in. So that's what I'm writing about now, that intersection between the two, which is what my podcast is about. I do a lot of stuff about psychological material, but the ones that I'm always the most interested in are the ones where the psychological and the spiritual come together.
It's so interesting because back to story and metaphor, which is, there's an idea that metaphor speaks to the soul, which is why story goes straight in beyond the psychological analysis. But where are you at with that intersection of spirituality and psychology? Where does that take you?
Well, it's taking me on a book about how to listen to the wisdom inside ourselves and the wisdom from outside ourselves. So that's the book that I'm currently writing at the moment.
Wow. And how did you become a writer?
How did I become a writer? I suppose that's because of who I am. It's a bit like asking, how you became a performer. Almost that's sort of what and this is the sort of like a spiritual sort of kind of answer. I think that's what I was sent here to do. There's an old myth that we all arrive with a task. Just the whole experience of being born makes us forget it, and then we have to think again and discover what our task is. And I'm here to communicate, and writing is, in my opinion, the best way of communicating, because you have enough time to think and delve really deeply into material on the page, and to reflect on it and take some time. So I find that's where I have my deepest thoughts on the page.
It makes so much sense, because just knowing you a little bit and seeing your videos and your podcast, and even I've got one of your books as I shared with you, the clarity, obviously you have that kind of brain where you're able to offer that clarity. It makes so much sense that's innate to you, that kind of way of working. Yeah.
Not really. I mean, I think if you write for newspapers, they teach you that they want 5 headings and a box here, and you have to think in that way. And when you've got something really horrible like infidelity, it just feels overwhelming. And if you do, the way I got into this topic was I didn't know where to start, and I suddenly thought, well, what are the different types of infidelity? That actually got me into it. And then I thought, what are the stages of it? And so immediately I had a bit of a structure. There are 7 stages that you're going to go through. It's more complicated than that, but actually you can understand the complications if you can see the golden path, so to speak. Now, nobody actually follows the golden path, but it's useful to know what it might look like.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And it reminds me of the Yellow Brick Road, or even Educating Rita, like you have to go there to go there. There are all those stories, like you said, in the myths. So would you mind speaking to the types of affairs? Perhaps we could talk about the 7 steps to mending an affair, but perhaps we could talk initially your types, and then the looking at how to look at these different types of affairs, which ones you can mend, which ones you can't mend. I'm reminded of Sarah Miles. She had an affair with Laurence Olivier for many years when he was married to Joan Plowright, and she called it good mistressing. She said some affairs keep a marriage together. So I don't know, could we speak about the different types of affairs that you've named?
Right. So 8 kinds of affairs. I think often that things are not as clear as I'm putting it down here, but I think a bit of clarity helps, and then we can look at the complexities. The first kind of affair is what I call an accidental affair, that you say to your partner, I didn't set out to have an affair. Now, it won't actually make them feel any less upset that you didn't plan it, but that's what has happened. They've often been short-term, one-night stand. There might have been alcohol involved, away on a conference. That's a very different kind of affair from some of the other ones that we're going to be talking about. The next one I think is really crucial to understand, and this is a cry for help. And this is not coming from the conscious world, it's coming from the unconscious world. And why do we have to have the difference between what we consciously do and what we unconsciously do? Well, we know what problems are. I mean, I can tell you now what was going on in my childhood about the fact that we weren't allowed to talk about feelings, but that nobody actually put a sign up saying, do not talk about feelings here. This message was given subliminally. So this was all happening unconsciously. And it happens a lot in a lot of marriages. There are subjects that you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to talk about money. Say, for example, you're a woman and you earn more than your husband. That might not be a topic that's actually allowed to be spoken about. And you have all sorts of ways of avoiding the topic. And these things get buried. And burying problems doesn't make them any better. I mean, it's taken me 60 years to learn that, but I promise you, burying problems doesn't make it better. But lots of people think, well, it might not make it better, but it means we don't have to think about it today. And these problems in the unconscious are getting bigger and bigger. And if you can't talk about things, how can you change them? And so the cry for help is that my life isn't working. Now, actually, driving the car against a brick wall is not going to help, but your unconscious is saying, I've had enough of this. So it can be an unconscious cry for help. Often people who do this kind of affair don't actually cover their traces particularly well, because on an unconscious level, they want to be found out. The third one is the retaliatory affair. This is the tit for tat affair. So you had an affair, I'll have an affair. But it can also be more complicated than that. You had a secret debt for £20,000 from your gambling, and I've forgiven you. But unconsciously, I'm really angry with you. And one way to get back at you might be to have an affair. All this is happening, quite a lot of it unconsciously. These are getting worse as we're getting a lot going along. The next one, which is the self-medication affair, which is like a sort of cry for help, but in a long-term kind of way. The sort of disappointment and unhappiness, maybe, for example, unresolved sexual issues. I can't tell you how many people that I've counseled when you say they've told you that they're shocked that their partner has gone off and had an affair. And you know, one of the standard questions is, tell me about your sex life. And you discover that people haven't actually had sex together for 6 or 7 years, and yet they're shocked that their partner has gone somewhere else. Well, that might be because these issues have not just been ignored, but they have actually got to the point where there is this huge long-term pain. The pain of not being touched, as you can possibly imagine, is horrendous. And one of the ways of dealing with that is to medicate. Now, that medication might be alcohol, it might be prescription drugs, or it might be having sex with somebody else. So it's a long-term problem that hasn't actually been dealt with. And it might not actually be anything to do with your relationship. It might be issues that go right back to your partner's childhood that they're self-medicating from. Then we have number 5 is the Don Juan and Donna Juana. This is often compulsive sexual behavior. And so the pain is so great that they've got to do a lot of self-medication. And this is where self-medication turns almost into addiction. You know, the stress of life is dealt with by having lots of affairs. So, you know, I once had a man who, whenever he had a problem, would get attention from other women. And it was almost the person he had the affair with was almost the first person who sent him a message back on Facebook from the extended group of friends. You know, it was not actually a choice that I like this woman more than I like that woman. It was a case of she was more interested and came back first. Sort of almost like, as I say, almost addictive sort of kind of behavior, certainly compulsive. Option number 6 is the tripod affair, which would be your definition of good mistressing, or maybe not particularly good mistressing, and everybody being incredibly unhappy in the tripod, but somehow it is a tripod is the strongest kind of system. If you have a tripod, a triangle, it's very difficult to break it, and this is where somehow the infidelity is baked into the relationship, which is very different from an open relationship or polyamory, where it's all been negotiated and everybody, in a sense, has bought into the system in some kind of way. In a tripod affair, that there isn't the consent, so that is different. Number 7, we're getting more and more serious, is the exploratory affair, which is, you know, I have got some unmet needs, and you actually explore what it'd be like to have those needs met. So rather than actually saying, look, this relationship isn't working for me, I want to end it, you know, I've got nowhere to go yet, but I know that this relationship is not right for me. What do you think? And having a discussion and properly closing down the relationship, one person goes off and actually explores what it would be like to have a relationship with another woman, for example, or doing something else that they've never been able to do beforehand. And then the last one is the exit affair, where actually it's not I've had an affair and I'm sorry, it's I've found somebody new and goodbye.
Well, this is marvelous, and I'm really looking forward to looking at the stages of looking at an affair. But I wondered if I could ask you a little bit more. It's such a great list. What I was wondering is, you know, with the Don Juan, I don't know if this would fit with the Don Juan, but I've come across sometimes couples, and one of them thinks they're monogamous, and they've been trundling along, even maybe for some time, and then the other one decides to come clean, and they've been having sometimes, you know, perhaps 6 encounters in a day, anonymous encounters, or lots of different sorts of things, and that may fit, like you said, into the area of addiction. And the other one is entirely shocked, like the world has crumbled, and then more and more seems to be coming out as well. The other one wants to make a shift. They are putting their hand up, and they may have done this ever since they were very, very young.
Yeah, there's lots of people who've never been faithful to their partner.
How would you look at that, or how would you support that? If somebody, they both want to look at this, but someone you could take has compulsive sexual acting out, and they've done it always, so they, you know, they don't know a life not doing that. And like you said, it's probably soothing some parts of their system that didn't know how else to soothe other than going and seeking that kind of soothing. But how would you look at that?
Right. Well, the sort of gold standard would be, first and foremost, let's say this is a man and a woman, and it's the woman who's discovered that her partner is compulsively unfaithful. First and foremost, she needs individual support, because the amount of shock, the amount of pain that needs to be processed, and to, you know, answer that question that she will want to ask, why me? What did I do wrong? I mean, the very quick answer is nothing, but you need plenty of time to unpack all of that. Some of it needs to be done with your partner, but some of this is just personal stuff. And if you're just going, which is basically what you need to do, that's going to actually build more wall between the two of you. So you need to have some help so that as well as going at your partner, you can actually also talk to them. So first and foremost, I might be involved because I'm the person that's supporting the discoverer. That if you have got compulsive sexual behavior, I think you also need to have some help and support for that, either from somebody who is experienced in dealing with compulsive sexual behavior, or in some kind of 7-step in a recovery program. And then you need somewhere that both of you can talk to each other about what's going on. So I know it seems like an awful lot of work, but in an ideal world, you'd have all three. I have worked where I've just got the couple, but I would ask the man, in the case that I'm talking about, but obviously are women as well, were in some kind of treatment program. And getting help for their individual material. So they're working through that and they can then talk. But I mean, it's exactly the same with when there's an addiction issue like alcohol, that in an ideal world, you have one person going to Alcoholics Anonymous, one person going to Al-Anon, for the family system, and then they're coming to me to bridge and talk about the couple stuff. And if you've got really ingrained and difficult infidelity, that sort of compulsive behavior, I think you need to have the full range of support.
Makes a lot of sense. And if people are nervous about going to groups, but they feel fine talking to you, would you still flag up, I think you need the extra supports if you're going to handle this?
Well, if you don't want to see a group, go and see an individual expert who would do that. I mean, I personally think that groups are wonderful because then you don't feel like you're the only terrible person in the world, and you tell everybody your deepest secrets.
That's right.
And they're all nodding and saying, yes, I've done that one too.
Yeah.
You feel a little less of a monster.
That's right.
And they can
yeah.
also call you out as well. They know all the tricks you play on yourself, and they can call you out and say, yeah, you're deluding yourself, because they've done it too. But if you don't want to do that, do it with an individual.
So if you had a couple and they were dealing with this issue, but they were a little resistant to going and get the other extra support, would you flag that up? I'm not sure how well we're going to do here if you don't do that, or what?
Yeah, I would always flag it up. I think we'd have to decide together if this is going to work or not. But you're asking me what I would recommend. What's the gold standard? I mean, it's a lot of money. So you might not be able to afford to do it all. And it might be you just do it in stages. The thing about infidelity, and I whisper this very quietly because nobody wants to hear it, it takes a long time to recover from infidelity. We want to be over it, 3 months at tops, let's get it over and done with by the end of the weekend if we can. And it doesn't work like that. I mean, I think it really takes 2 years at the minimum. And if you've got a really complex one, it might take several years, and there'll be new pockets of pain that will come up. And that doesn't mean that it's all impossible. It just means you've got another pocket of pain to work on. And thank goodness you didn't get it all at one time, because you would have been overwhelmed.
Brilliant. And what about the 7-step process to mend an affair? Would that be okay to speak to that?
Yep. So once again, this is just a general idea. It won't go like this, but particularly at the very beginning, I think it's really important to understand that the first stage is shock and disbelief, because it is impossible to believe that your partner could do these things. And you might not, because you're in shock, be able to actually hear what they're saying. They might have to say it to you more than once because you're just sort of closing down because this is more than you can cope with. And it's not a good idea to make long-term decisions when you're in shock. So, if you can't cope, go and visit your mother for the weekend. Don't leave the relationship forever. The next stage is intense questioning, because you've been kept in the dark and you want to know what's happened. And you might have to ask the same questions many times. It's going to be very difficult for your partner. I would like to believe that they will tell you everything the first time round, but unfortunately, history tells me that they will probably try and minimize some of the things they've done, because it's just going to seem too terrible. And this is not because they're terrible people, it's because nobody likes to face that amount of shame. So it's going to take a while to get the questions out. And until you actually know what you're dealing with, until you've actually walked around the car crash and seen how badly the car is, you can't really make a decision. And that's why it's, surprisingly enough, only stage 3 where you make a decision about what you're going to do. And the temptation is, you hear that your partner's had an affair and you like that, the decision. And it's probably better to give yourself a couple of weeks to get out of the shock, to start asking the questions. And sometimes people do something that is equally bad as leaving, is actually forgiving their partner. I forgive you. How can you forgive them? Because you don't actually know 100% what they've done. There might be something in there, like they had sex in your bed, that they are not going to tell you right at the very beginning, but might be something you can't forgive. So, and also, actually, once you forgive, they're terrified of telling you that extra piece of information as well, because they might undo what's already happened. So I would be tempted to not forgive until you actually know what it is that you're going to be forgiving. So that's why decision time, are we going to split up? Are we going to try and work on this relationship? Can I stay in this relationship? It might be that you do need to have a bit of time apart. It's all fine, but let's make that decision when you have got a little bit more of the information together. After you've made a decision, this is a good point, you'll have a bit of hope. And you'll think, well, maybe we can actually do this, and it actually feels better. You've faced it and it all feels better. We can work on this, we can make it better. And then we come another phase, which is called attempted normality. So I've forgiven you for your horrible cheating ways, and you've apologized, you've told me everything, I've said, let's put this behind us and let's move forward. And, we have a wonderful weekend. We have lots of great sex, because make-up sex is some of the hottest sex you'll ever have. And we try and pretend everything is normal, but it ain't normal. If it's, my whole world has been turned upside down by what's happened. And I'm not quite certain how much it has, but I'm just trying to stay in that hope and that attempted normality. And, bits of attempted normality is great, because after you've been spending, talking for 4 nights in a row till 4 o'clock in the morning, you probably need a bit of attempted normality just to catch up on your sleep. But you don't want to get stuck in that place. And the next stage is the bit that we therapists think is absolutely wonderful, and the general public absolutely loathe. And I call it bodies floating up to the surface. The dead bodies, all those topics that you really do not want to talk about, that you've spent the last 20 years ignoring, all come to face you. And sometimes these are things that you're not actually particularly aware of, or maybe you know, but you haven't been aware of how deeply they've affected you. So, for example, your mother had an affair when you were a child, and you might have even witnessed something of it, or you might have been used as a cover. You were being taken to the park, and you knew that your mother was meeting her fancy piece. This is my grandmother's phrase. I'm afraid I'm very drawn to it. The fancy piece.
Love it, love it.
And you half know this and you've half forgotten it. And this would be an example of a body coming up to the surface. I've had lots of men who will tell their wives they've been unfaithful, and about 10 minutes later will be talking about how they were sexually abused as children, for example, or they were groomed by somebody but not actually abused, but all the icky feelings are still there. And for example, sometimes somebody who's been unfaithful has been groomed by the lover, and it sort of brings all this material back up again. This is the bodies floating to the surface.
If a couple, let's say you've done marvelous work and a lot of safety's got created and they're much more connected and they're ready to deal with the bodies, and then they start cancelling appointments, because they're actually afraid of looking at the bodies, what would you do then?
Well, I have to say that therapy has to be voluntary. So
Yes.
I'm not going to go round to their house and knock on their door and say, how's about it? And so what I do is I trust that when the time is right, they will come back or they will go to somebody else, because I believe that the urge to heal is very deep inside us, and that these bodies can be faced with help and with time and patience. And then the final stage is intense learning. So we learn a lot about ourselves, we learn a lot about our partners, we learn how to communicate better. And so that next time round there are difficult topics, we don't bury them, we actually deal with them. Now, nobody goes through that. When you get to bodies floating to the surface, these might be secret parts of the affair that you haven't been told about. That you find a video of your partner having sex with the affair partner, and they're doing things in this video that are shocking. Well, you're going to go right back to the very beginning and shock and disbelief that your partner could do this kind of kinky sex. And you've got lots of questions, and you've got to decide what, you can go back through the whole system again. Generally, when you come back a second or third or seventh time, you get over the shock and disbelief a bit quicker. But it's not a one-time journey. You will take time going backwards and forwards. There'll be more hope, there'll be more attempted normality, and there'll be more bodies that come up to the surface. As a therapist, I say wonderful.
So do you think, how some people want to, they go, oh, we've gone so far, now we pack it away. Do you think you can't avoid certain of the stages? Or do you think some people can go, oh, we're okay now, let's pack a bit of that away, we're not going to look at all certain things and we're going to move on now?
Yeah, I think lots of people do that, and that is fine. If that is what works for you, brilliant. And if you find 18 months later, actually the pain and the distress is still there, please listen to it. You ultimately, know best what is best for you. So, I'm talking in generalities. I'm talking of what, most people might do, or what I believe is right. But the person who knows what's best for you is you.
And how would you deal with children, people who've got children and affairs coming out?
Well, in my ideal world, they would know as little as possible. I mean, the very worst thing you can do is recruit your son or your daughter for being your ally to either attack your partner or to be your agony aunt. That sort of picture with the Prince and Princess of Wales, where the children were pushing tissues under the bathroom door to the mother. That's not really where you want your children to be.
That explains so much. And can you affair proof your relationship?
Well, I think it depends what day you catch me. If I'm actually writing an article on that subject, I would give you some jolly good ways of affair proofing your relationship, which in the core of them is about communication, being able to talk, be able to sit with difficult stuff, and being conscious of what that difficult stuff is. There's another part of me that says that's a little bit naive, because we want to have black and white versions of the world where you're invincible, and having lived in the world where people die when they're in their 40s, the world isn't quite as simple as that. So I think my answer will depend on when you are asking me and on exactly what you mean by a fair proof.
So, Andrew, I wondered if I could ask you about the idea that, in this era where people live a lot longer than perhaps they're used to, whether there's something about people seeking affairs, or some people are open, some people are poly, some people I don't want to be open, but it's part of their journey of life, and there's different parts to the puzzle, and that maybe like all kinds of things, we learn through all kinds of things, and maybe affairs is another place where people learn or grow. And like, I think I've heard you say that sometimes after an affair, a relationship can possibly, and I've experienced this, I've seen this, the relationship is transformed to a whole nother level that wouldn't have happened but for the affair.
Well, I think that with us living longer, we are probably going to have several marriages, but there's no reason why those several marriages can't be to the same person, in the sense that the kind of marriage you're going to need in your 20s is going to be a very different kind of marriage to the one you're going to need in your 60s. So you've almost sort of got to reinvent your marriage for the different stages of your life. So yes, I don't think you can just put your relationship into aspic and leave it like that. It has to grow. But I don't think you need to have affairs to help it to grow. I think that the one thing you failed to mention was the topic of consent. Because there's a big difference of saying, look, I'm having problems. I think that I might be polyamorous, or I want to explore this kind of sex and you're not interested in it. There's a big difference between having a proper discussion about that and then deciding that you're getting the consent of your partner to do these things, and effectively just not getting consent, but stealing from your partner. So one of the things that has changed in my work in Berlin is I have a huge number of people come to me to actually debate, do we want to have an open relationship or not? And this is 10, 20 sessions we're discussing what each partner's fears are and what exactly they mean by an open relationship, because there's not one size fits all. Each couple is going to have a different interpretation of that. So you can get informed consent. And it could be that if you can't get informed consent, then actually you don't want to be in this relationship, and then you can actually close the relationship down together effectively. Once again, that will probably take time. I want to do this. I want to explore shall we just make it a really nice, clean cut thing? You know, I think I might be bisexual. I want to explore this part of my life. Obviously, you don't want to be in a relationship with somebody who's going to have people on the side. And therefore, we're going to go our separate ways. We're both going to be sad about this, but we're going to go as friends. We're going to leave as friends and hopefully co-partners to look after our children. That's very different from sneaking off and doing it without consent.
So thank you very much, Andrew. You know, maybe I just put this to you. What's your feeling about long-term relationships?
I think that they're becoming more and more wonderful, to be perfectly honest, that we are now saying we're going to have the relationship that's right for us. You know, we're not going to take down from in my example, I don't want the same relationship that my parents had. They were very happy together for nearly 60 years. But it was not the sort of relationship that I would want. And we are putting together combinations of relationships that are right for us today. You know, we're prepared to talk about these things. I mean, I've been doing this for over 35 years, and relationships have changed a huge amount. We are much, much more willing to go for therapy. When I first started, one of my questions was, you know, and what's your experience been of therapy beforehand? You know, have you had any work together individually or apart? And, you know, it was a surprise if people had something. Nowadays, I'm surprised if people haven't had anything at all. And that is really wonderful because it means that people are much more self-aware. Hopefully, they're better at negotiating with each other, and they can design the relationship that is right for them, as opposed to what the Pope, what the Queen, or Uncle Tom Cobley thinks is the right kind of relationship to have. So we have the relationship that's right for us, and we don't have to get the approval of somebody else. That can also be more difficult because, you know, it's very easy to take something down off the shelf. It takes a long time to design it for yourself, but that can be a very exciting journey.
Wow, that's a fabulous, fabulous way to end this glorious conversation. Thank you, Andrew. I could speak to you more and more and more, and perhaps if you're available, I will see if that's a possibility. Wow, thank you so much. I just feel this is so rich. I already know who I'm going to send this to because it was so rich. And just bless your heart for spending this time with me and all your service to the world, because your experience is so in depth, which means you can move around a subject like affairs in such a vast way. So thank you for that, and wishing you a lovely day.
And thank you for having me on, and thank you for being a guest on my podcast as well and talking about flirting. So have a listen to that episode with Kate and I talking about flirting. I think we did a bit of flirting together, didn't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all part of stage one, safety, attunement, isn't it? Small talk, which many of us need to practice a lot of the time. We stop doing it with our partners, we stop doing it with anyone, and it's so important. Hi, how are you? Would you like a cup of tea? You know, it's so simple, but without it, life doesn't run that smoothly.
And we've been able to have this deep conversation because we did that basic work on that other podcast.
Oh, that's so nice. That's so nice. I agree. And that's so nice. It just speaks to that safety, which is in a way what I think you're talking about with the depth of the work that needs to be done around affairs. That container of safety has to be there, because, you know, the person who's had the affairs, how on earth would they open up if that safety is not there? And how on earth would the other person's effective trauma response calm down without the safety? So just thank you so much. And that's attunement, isn't it? And that's kind of creating that safety from the therapist to the couple potentially. So yeah, thank you for that. And creating the safety with me. You're right. We had a lovely, I had a lovely time with you. I had a lovely session with you, Andrew. Had a lovely podcast with you. And I really get what you create with your couples. Really, it's so clear. So I am going to possibly write to you again, Andrew, and to see if you're free in your busy schedule for other chats, if that seems possible to you. So yeah, fantastic. So thank you. That was wonderful and just huge, but so much was said. So and I think that's the thing, like you said, it's not one size fits all, but there are stops on the journey that can be named. So bless your heart. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was Andrew G. Marshall. Do listen to his podcast. It's fantastic. You can access it on Apple Podcasts, his website, all different places. It's a really great podcast. I did one on flirting, and I was so excited to be asked by him because I had one of his books, and I suddenly got this message on Twitter, would I consider being on his podcast? Now I was a bit kind of starstruck. So yeah, and you can see why. He's so clear, he's so thoughtful, he's so thought out, and he's able to explain all these things so wonderfully for those of us who'd like to know more or to have some structure planned out. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please tune in for more, and hope you have a lovely day. Thanks.